Okay, today's lecture is going to be a little bit different because I'm actually not going to be doing a lecture on Chapter 6. We only have 3 chapters this week and 4 lectures to do. Not only that, but Chapter 6 is about the emotional and social development of infants and toddlers. And we're going to kind of have a running theme of this. We'll be doing emotional and social development of a lot of different stages. And that's part of what I study is emotional. I'm a social psychologist and I study emotions as well. So I'm going to be giving you a little bit of background on emotions because the book really doesn't, and I see why. It has 19 chapters to begin with, but I think it kind of does it an injustice because it's very difficult to understand the emotional development of anything if you don't even understand emotions. And emotions are very very difficult to understand. There's a reason there's a whole branch of psychology based around emotions, and more importantly, there are a lot of misunderstandings on emotions. So I'll try to be going over some of those things today, kind of how we define emotions, how we need to be looking at them, and how, for lack of a better description, you have to stop looking at emotions the way you have pretty much your entire life. First of all, emotions and motivations are inexorably linked. And you'll see this in like an introductory psychology textbook. You'll see that the emotion chapter is usually about emotions and a motivation. But they're usually pretty vague on exactly what the link is, although it has been studied. Essentially, we don't know what our own motivations are. We think we do. We really love to believe that we know what our motivations are, and it even insults a lot of us to think that we don't know what our motivations are. But we found out that we don't. We have almost no clue into this hidden part of our brain that motivates us. Freud would call it an unconscious. Other people, such as Jung and whatnot, would call it a collective unconscious. There's always this idea that there's this hidden part of our brain that is clearly thinking about things all the time, and this is the part that really drives us, that really motivates us. And no matter what you happen to call it, it is definitely true that there's a lot of ourselves that we don't have access to, and our motivational component is one of them. And they tested this in some pretty cool scientific experiments. One of the old classics that they had a puzzle room. And in the puzzle room, it was basically a glorified janitor's closet, limited fundings as though it was, and but it worked really well for the experiment. The puzzle was that they had 2 ropes hanging from the ceiling, and the idea was that you had to tie these 2 ropes together, but they were too far apart so that you had to tie them together pretty tall, and if you were to grab one rope, you couldn't grab the other because they were just too far apart. So they said, okay, you have to solve this puzzle. How are you going to do this? And there are actually 4 ways to solve this particular puzzle. The first way, for example, is to extend your arm in some way. You grab a stick or a pole or something, and then you reach out and you hook the other rope and you get it and you bring it over and you tie them together, and that's fine. The other way is to extend the rope itself, to tie one rope to the other rope, and then you're not extending your arm, you're extending the rope. These are the sorts of solutions that the puzzle has. It's not all that difficult. I forget what the third one is off the top of my head. But the fourth one was actually the most difficult one to solve. The idea was that this fourth solution was to get one of them swinging. And you had to tie something to the bottom of the rope, and then you could get it swinging like a pendulum, and then when it came towards you, you could grab it. And so there was a percentage of people that in this puzzle room could not get this one. They just weren't thinking of the fourth solution. They thought of all the other 3. Those were relatively easy to think of. And so of the people that couldn't think of it, they gave them about 15 minutes. This is just 15 minutes of not being able to figure out a damn thing on how to solve this puzzle. They were just at a loss. And 15 minutes is a long time to be locked up in a room. And so the experimenter came in, and of course he could see the whole thing the whole time anyway, but they didn't know that. And he said, okay, so you can't solve anything. He's like, no, we've got no idea whatsoever. He's like, okay, well, I'll tell you what. And he walked over to the window, and when he walked over, he bumped into one of the ropes. And he hit it pretty hard so that it started swinging, and it started swinging back and forth, as what happens when you bump into a rope. And he's like, okay, well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you another 5 minutes, and we'll see if you can do it by then. And after that, well, we'll just call the experiment a wash. And then he left. After he did this, which is a very casual thing, nobody noticed, and they asked afterwards. 95% of the people, it was somewhere in there. I'm actually forgetting the exact statistic off the top of my head, but a huge majority of the people solved the problem within the next couple of minutes. And again, these are people who had been at a deadlock for 15 minutes, had not been able to figure it out, but now they figure it out. So they said, okay, well, great, you figured out the problem. That's great. What made you think of this? And everybody had a reason for it. One person said, like, well, I remember when I was a kid, there was a tire swing that we would swing on all the time. And for some reason, I just started thinking of the tire swing, and I realized, oh, well, if this was swinging like the tire swing, then that would work fine. Another person might say, we had a big grandfather clock in our house when I was a kid, and I thought about the pendulum swinging, and I thought, well, maybe if this swung like the pendulum. And the fact is, out of every single person that did this, not a single one of them noticed him bump into it and have it swing, and not a single one of them thought that swinging had anything to do with it. They came up with this BS rationalization as to why they actually got the solution. And as a matter of fact, and then they asked everybody, they're like, okay, well, just to let you know, we didn't actually bump into it and set it swinging. So what, do you think this actually influenced your decision in any way? Do you think this actually made you think of it? And only one person actually admitted, he said, I don't think so, but I guess it's possible. Who's just kind of an open-minded guy. Every single other person was 100% convinced that their own rationalization is what led them to believe this, is what led them to come up with this idea. And this experiment is just a great example of how we have no idea about what motivates us, about what actually gets us thinking about things or doing things. Now, you notice this whole time I'm not talking about what gets us to feel things. And the reason for that is because that is the entire point of emotions, is we have no idea what is driving us to do anything. The only way we have of knowing what our motivations are is through emotions. Emotions, the phrase here to remember is emotions are the readout of motivation. Motivation does not show itself. It only shows itself through our emotions. Consider your emotions a window, a foggy one, admittedly, but they are a window to your motivations. And the reason this is so important is because in this society, in humans in general, we have a tendency to think of emotions as things to worship, as things to strive for. They're reverent and sacred to us. How many religions base themselves on love? But love itself is not an end result. It is an emotion. Therefore, it is just a readout to what your true motivations are. Love is designed to go along with motivations. And I mentioned the motivation first because it has something to do with what the definition is of emotion. Things that make up anything that is a readout for motivation is an emotion. No matter how secretive or enigmatic that emotion or motivation happens to be. So hunger is an emotion. And we don't often think of it like an emotion because it's not one of these sacred emotions like love or hate or joy or happiness or sadness, these things that we cling on to as if they're a part of ourselves bigger than all the other millions of parts of ourselves. But hunger is clearly, your body has chemical components in it. Your brain needs sugars. And your brain doesn't use sugars from fat very well at all. It kind of needs fresh sugars. And this is what gives us hunger. Contrary to popular belief, it's not the emptiness of the stomach that makes you hungry. It's your brain needing sugars. And so when your brain needs sugars, your brain has no method of telling your body it's time to eat other than an emotion, hunger. You feel hungry. So you get this emotion, you're then driven to eat, and that satisfies the motivational component. The motivation goes away, and therefore the emotion goes away as well. And all other emotions are like this. We need safety. We need safety and security and shelter. And so we want to love. We want to pair bond and get in groups and cluster together. And this helps us thrive because then we're not just by ourselves, we're with other people as well. And it makes our lives significantly easier. But again, this love is simply a motivational component, is simply a window to the motivation of safety and security. And again, the emotion itself is not an end result. It is a very, very obvious and slightly too often paid attention to middleman. Now, of emotions, again, since they're the only component, they're still very important. I'm not saying to discount emotions by any stretch of the imagination. They're so important because they're the only window that we have to our motivational components to begin with. As such, there are 3 types of emotions, and I know they don't go over these in the book. Actually, Dr. Ross Buck from the University of Connecticut has been studying these for years. And they were named very well. They're called Emotion 1, Emotion 2, and Emotion 3. I guess he didn't like to mince words and come up with fancy words for things. Makes it a little bit easier to remember. And as you'll know, I want you to really pay attention to the 3 types of emotion, because as you go through, especially when reading chapter 6, I want you to look at all these things. That anytime anybody talks about emotion, figure out what sort of emotion is it. Is it emotion 1, is it emotion 2, or is it emotion 3? Because there are vast differences. And one of the huge failings in the emotional literature, and indeed in how we speak of emotions, is that we tend to look at one sort of emotion and pretend that it's a different type of emotion. And that's just not the case. They're really separate components, and they're all very important to us. Emotion 1 is the physiological aspect of emotions. So when you are fearful, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, and we can measure all these. Emotion 1 is the physiological state of emotion. This is measurable by machines. By anybody with a machine. Anybody can listen to your heart rate. And when you get frightened or excited or scared, that's going to increase. You can take blood samples and find increased cortisol levels for somebody that has a lot of specific heightened emotional states, perhaps more for fear than with love or something like that. And so you have all these chemical and physiological changes, and that's emotion 1. And that's very important, and we really like that because as far as measuring things, we like to be able to say, well, somebody's definitely feeling an emotion here, and they know that because they tested their galvanic skin response with a little finger machine. Now, emotion 2 is the display. And people disregard this, but we shouldn't, because there's a lot of times we don't disregard it and we consider it the most important thing. And that is the display. So when you are frightened, you will act fearful. And people will see this. When you are happy, you are smiling. And this is something that people see, and this one is observable by pretty much everybody. It is often more observable by other people than it is yourself. The dog might not know it's wagging its tail, but it is giving you a display of emotion. Now, the third one is the most often talked about, although not necessarily the most important one, and that is the very subjective feeling that you get. So, the emotion 1, the physiological state, might be very similar between love and hate. If you're feeling a great hate or a great love, your heart rate's going to increase, your blood pressure's going to increase, you're going to have firing of endorphins. And physiologically, these are very difficult to kind of parse apart. There's a couple of different chemicals going on, but they're very, very close. On the other hand, the subjective feeling is vastly different. It's the world of difference between love and hate. How it actually makes you feel. The trick is, emotion 3 is observable only by the person feeling it. It is not observable by anybody else. It cannot be measured. It can be very subjectively graded on a scale of 1 to 10, I suppose. You can say, well, I'm feeling a lot of love or I'm feeling a little bit of love. But it's not very easy to observe. So when you look at your dog, and I went over the fact that your dog doesn't love you already, or at the very least it is incredibly improbable that it's anything even similar to what we look at as love. It clearly has emotion too. It has a display. Your dog will come up and display what we look at as affection. However, we cannot presume to know emotion 3. You cannot say, my dog loves me, pretending that you understand emotion 3 only because you're seeing emotion 2. Essentially what you're saying is, my dog is displaying actions that I interpret as love. But he might get he might be hungry. That might be the subjective feeling that he has. Physiologically, we might be able to tease out the different neurotransmitters produced, and we might find out that it's more similar to our hate, but it's like a sucking up kind of hate because they know we're the ones that feed them. We really have no clue about these things. And you'll notice the same thing when we look at infants and toddlers. We're going to be looking at different things, like we'll look at emotion 2, or we'll look at emotion 1. But with infants and toddlers, we simply can't ask them about emotion 3 because they can't communicate very well yet. So they can't communicate these very subjective aspects. Now, we're going to be getting into this a little bit more. I'll be talking about emotional communication the entire semester. Emotional communication, and more importantly, emotional education for the aspects of both the toddlerhood and the childhood. And this is because one of the drawbacks in emotions, in childhood, and dealing with emotions, is that we need to learn to deal with the emotions that we have, because, like I said, emotions are the only way we can know our motivation. So if we did not feel emotions really strongly, we probably wouldn't actually be motivated to do it. We're designed to want to pay attention to our emotions. That is why we consider them so sacred and reverent in this. They're very artificial if you look at it, but we're specifically designed to want to pay a lot of attention to them. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to learn to deal with them. So, and this is, as a parent or as an educator or any of these things, this is what you need to do in order to have somebody who can actually deal with their emotions well. So I'll give you a classic example. Little Billy and little Susie are playing with a doll. Little Billy grabs the doll from little Susie, so little Susie grabs the doll back, beats him on the head with it. Little Billy starts crying. If anybody's ever been even nearby a kid, you'll have seen this happen. Very common. Now, obviously, the first instinct of a parent is to punish little Susie for hitting little Billy. And I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't punish for this, but there's something else to do as well. Obviously, you don't want little Susie to continue this action, so a punishment will be fine, immediate, all that stuff. But at the same time, you also need to speak to little Susie. And this isn't some kind of touchy-feely, trying to let them get to know their inner selfness type of thing. This is actually their job is to understand what it's like to be human, what it's like to live and learn and really not just not hitting people because somebody else told them not to hit, but because they understand why you're not supposed to hit. So you talk to Susie and you say, Susie, why did you hit him? Well, he took my toy. It's like, yes, he did take your toy, but why did you actually hit him? Him taking your toy does not instinctively cause you to hit him. What were you feeling that made you hit him? And she'll describe something because she doesn't really understand these things that well. It's like, well, it made me sad, or he was being mean, or any of these little childish ways of describing emotion. And you're like, okay, what you were feeling was frustration. And frustration also always often comes with anger. You get frustrated when you don't get your way. So that's what this emotion is. That's what you were feeling, and it can be very overpowering. It can be a very powerful emotion, but you need to know what it is, and you need to know how to deal with it. When you're feeling frustrated, there are other things to do when you're frustrated. Now, not only will little Susie be not to do it again because she has been punished for this, but now she's going to deal with frustration in a better fashion in other situations as well, because they don't generalize punishment all that easily. She might not hit him on the head again, but she might scream next time when she's being frustrated because the game isn't going her way. But if you let her know about the emotions, then and educate her on the types of things you can do that in your household are good to do when you're frustrated. Sometimes it's taking time out. Some people don't do the scream into a pillow thing. That was like an 80s fad, and it never really worked all that well, and a horrible idea for children. But you can take some time out, or or just say, look, I'm being really frustrated. You're gonna give me a break for a little while, or whatever it is that you need to do in your household. But learning how to deal with the frustration, you're just going to have less problems in the future, and they're going to be a lot more emotionally well adjusted. One of the things you'll notice as we get into the adolescent chapter is teenagers suck. Basically, there's no other way to describe this. Teenagers are just let's face it, they're about the lamest creatures on the planet. And the reason they are is because they have most of the knowledge of an adult. They have most of the physical development of the adult. But what they lack is the emotional education of an adult. I mean, if you think about, to anybody here who's not a teenager anymore, if you think back to all the little teen angsty drama garbage that you thought when you were a teenager, those problems are totally insignificant. Life as a teenager is like one long vacation for most people. You have no responsibilities, you have no job, no matter how badly you mess up, nothing really bad is going to happen. I mean, as an adult, something bad happens and you get fired and you can't afford to feed your family for the next month. It's a lot worse things that can happen as an adult than as a teenager. But people get so stressed out as a teenager. These little social things that you would just totally dismiss as an adult become really important as a teenager. And that's because they don't actually understand how to deal with the emotions that they have. They've simply never been taught. And that's why I start going over it in the toddlerhood, because this is when you can really start to understand the emotions, and when you really need to be taught so that you can be a far more well-adjusted teenager. Because let's face it, not every teenager makes mountains out of molehills. They're not all drama queens. Some of them are very well-adjusted, and when they have a social problem, they just dismiss it just like an adult would. And so the idea is to kind of foster this sort of thing so that they can mature and grow faster and develop a lot better. So tomorrow I'll go over Chapter 6. In the meantime, one thing I really recommend that you do is to study. Study as if the test were tomorrow. Study Chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 tonight as if the test is tomorrow. And then tomorrow I'll be going over Chapter 6. So then study 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is a technique called overlearning. You study more than once. I mean, I fully expect people to cram, the day before. That's just what we do, and it's actually very effective. But do it more than once. And that second time, don't just say, well, I already studied that last time, so I'm not going to do it this time. No. Study it again. It'll actually cement it in your brain and not only make it so much easier to access the memories when it comes time to take the test, but it will also keep the memories there for a long, long time. You won't just forget it right after the test. It helps a lot. So tonight, study chapters 1 through 5 as if you have the test tomorrow. And then tomorrow we'll be going over chapter 6. And then you can study all that in chapter 6.